Welcome to Sunday mornings. Well, it should be Sundays at the Marxist Library because we have participants from many different time zones now, all around the United States and even around the world. My name is Alan Miller, and I will be hosting this meeting. I'm a member of the program committee that organizes Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library. And I would like to start out by saying that we always welcome input, feedback, suggestions for topics and speakers. You can contact us through our website at ICSSmarx.org. A quick note is that this session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube. The weekly program, Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library, is part of the Institute for the Critical Study of Society, which in pre-pandemic times was hosted at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library, located in Oakland, California in the USA. During the pandemic, and likely afterwards, we will be meeting digitally on Zoom, although we still solicit donations to support the work of the Marxist Library. For a decade and a half of Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library programs, we have been a platform for diverse presentations on topics in political economy, capitalism, socialism, communism, imperialism, militarism, and war. We have consciously, and I hope successfully, cultivated a culture of mutual respect and the understanding that we do not necessarily agree on all matters. Rather, this is a comradely forum for political discourse and debate. The opinions expressed here are those of the participants. They do not represent the ICSS or Marxist Library. However, we are united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, and we believe that his work remains relevant today. Our speaker today is KJ No. He is a scholar, educator, and journalist focusing on the political economy and geopolitics of the Asia Pacific. He writes for Dissident Voice, Black Agenda Report, Counterpunch, Popular Resistance, Asia Times, LA Progressive, Monthly Review Online, and is a senior correspondent for KPFA Radio Flashpoints. He also does frequent commentary and analysis on various news programs, including The Critical Hour, By Any Means Necessary, Fault Lines, Political Misfits, Loud and Clear, and The Socialist Program. KJ is one of our most popular speakers. He's been here at the library several times before. Today, he will be speaking on the topic, is the US preparing for war with China in the South China Sea? A timely and very important topic. KJ, we want to warmly welcome you to our meeting to speak today.
Thank you so much. I'm very honored. I've been involved with the NPML for actually close to 2 decades, and I'm always happy to join this august group and share some of the work that I've been doing. This is a fairly complex topic, and it's fairly involved. So I'll just go ahead and barrel ahead and share my PowerPoint, and then as we go along, I'll also perhaps pause and check in from time to time, make sure that I'm not overwhelming you with facts and figures. The key point that I want to make is the US is on the cusp, it's on the precipice of war with China. And the key area which war could explode is in the South China Sea. So without any further ado, I am going to share my PowerPoint. So as you can see here, this is the South China Sea. This is a map from the 1940s, and the US has clearly mapped out the different trade routes and the various logistical actions, flows of the South China Sea. As you can see, there's a tiny bottleneck near Malaysia called the Straits of Malacca. And this is one of the key reasons why the South China Sea is going to be a key flashpoint. So very recently, actually on the anniversary of the judgment of the arbitral tribunal, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken asserted that conflict in the South China Sea between the Philippines and China could be a trigger for US war against China. Secretary Blinken invoked the US Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951, in particular, Article 4. Essentially, it says that an attack in the Pacific area on Philippine or US vehicles or parties would essentially result in a casus belli. This comes not randomly, but as a kind of ongoing process. There's a momentum. As we know, the US is rallying all of its allies to form a bloc against China. That includes the G7, NATO, the Quad, the Five Eyes. There's been a belligerent brinksmanship and escalation of exercises in the South China Sea, so much so that, you know, at certain times it's practically a traffic jam, and it's actually a miracle that we haven't exploded into war already. And of course, this also exists in the current context of hybrid war against China, which is economic war, trade war, tech war, prosecution of Chinese researchers, i.e., researching while Chinese, and sanctions, and also the weaponization of human rights against China, in particular, the fraudulent claims around Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and other places. So the key thing we have to understand about the South China Sea is there are 6 claimants to portions of the South China Sea. They're China, Taiwan, Philippines, Indonesia, Brunei, Malaysia, and Vietnam. Now, if you look at this, all of them have made different claims, and their claims bisect, trisect, quadrisect. It's a very, very complex issue. The key thing to understand is that these claims are a result of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which essentially created the 200-kilometer exclusive economic zone. This, I will show you later, was actually an imperialist plan to both reclaim ocean territory, but also to divide and conquer. Okay, now the background to the current escalation between the Philippines and China and the United States is that in 2013, the US engineered a case in the arbitral tribunal, which the Philippines won in 2016. And I say won with air quotes around it. Essentially, they were regarding the Spratly Islands, the Scarborough Shoal, and the Paracel Islands. Now, there's some key facts we have to know. The first is that the United States is not a party to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It refuses to ratify it. So the US is asserting that it will enforce a claim based on the Philippine judgment is absurd. And this is essentially how the rules-based international order works. The US wants to have its cake and eat it too. It does not want to be a party to the UN clause, but it wants to enforce it. The other key thing to understand is the tribunal was a private arbitration, and it was illegally imposed on China. So although the general framing is that it was some kind of massive UN decision, actually, no, it was a private court that was hired and bought for, and then rendered the judgment that it wanted. Okay, so these are the islands themselves. And once again, you can see it's a fairly complex geography with all 6 countries making different claims to the different islands. Now, the key thing to understand is sovereignty, territorial sovereignty is the key issue. We have to understand who owns the islands. And once we determine who owns the islands, then you can determine who has the 200 kilometer exclusive economic rights around them. Now, the Chinese claims go back to the 2nd century BC to the Han Dynasty, and they have historical documents and historical arguments relating to this. The Vietnamese probably also have a claim to them. They claim inheritance from the French colonial period when the French colonized the entire South China Sea. And they also claim, kind of existing usage at the time. Now, the Philippines claim is the weakest because they are claiming terra nullius. Terra nullius is this Western colonial doctrine which says that the lands are uninhabited. For example, the Americas were considered terra nullius, and therefore they can claim them. So it's a colonial claim. They claim that the land is uninhabited, therefore it belongs to them, and it falls within their EEZ. They also claim that Thomas Clona, a Filipino businessman and adventurer, discovered these islands. Again, once again, the terra nullius claim, like Captain James Cook, and then sold them to the Filipino government for $1. So that is the setup for the contestation. Now, the simple fact is that all of these claims would have been prevented by the San Francisco Treaty and the Cairo and the Potsdam Declarations after the Japanese surrendered. Remember, the Japanese took over the entire South China Sea during World War II. And when they surrendered, all of these claimed territories by Japanese colonialism should have reverted to their original owners, or at least they would have been clarified at the time. The problem was that the United States excluded the Chinese from all of these treaties, and therefore the mix-up in contestation remained. Now, all of this would not be an issue because there are hundreds of border and island disputes. I'll give you a list later, but there are hundreds of these disputes, and all of these are currently in some degree of litigation or negotiation between the different parties. The reason why the South China Sea, and in particular the Philippines-China issue became a key issue is because of the pivot to Asia. Now, the pivot to Asia, as you all probably know, is the US plan to contain, stymie, and suppress China. And it involves encircling China with 400 bases, armed to the teeth with missile systems and various bilateral military agreements, military exercises, etc. It's essentially an arms race, a territorial battle, and it's essentially the preparation for war with China. So this is the US strategy, is what is called the first island chain and the second island chain. The US has surrounded China with bases all along the first island chain, in particular in Japan, in South Korea, on Jeju Island, and then all along the Ryukyu Islands, i.e. Okinawa, and then Taiwan. Taiwan is the centerpiece of this encirclement. And then it continues along to Manila, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore. And it's essentially a complete encirclement. The other piece of this is that these are the trade routes, and you can see once again that most of the trade travels through this very, very narrow strait called the Malacca bottleneck, or the Malacca Straits. So the US has wargamed out that if it wages a shooting war in this area, it can bring down China's economy very rapidly. It doesn't actually have to win the war. All it needs to do is engage in war. Okay, so the geostrategy is actually, there's a term for it. It's called air-sea battle. And the term is a reference to the Soviet era air-land battle. The US battle doctrine against the Soviet Union during the Cold War was called air-land battle. And starting around 2010, or even earlier than that, the US developed something called air-sea battle, which was eventually publicized in 2013. Air-sea battle is the war doctrine against China. Another important document which I invite people to go and look at is a document called War with China. It's called Thinking Through the Unthinkable, and it's written by the very, very sharp people at RAND. Okay, and all of this ties into the much larger geopolitical context, which is the Wolfowitz Doctrine, or the Defense Planning Guidance Document of 1992. Essentially, the document says that in the post-Soviet era, the United States has to have full spectrum dominance, that it should be the unipolar global hegemon, and it should prevent any other country from challenging US supremacy or US superiority. And of course, in 1992, looking out at the distant horizon, the US was already preparing for war against China. The Wolfowitz Doctrine eventually became the project for a new American century, which brought us the wars in the Middle East. And that became the Bush Doctrine, which became the Obama Doctrine, which became the Trump Doctrine, which is now currently the Biden Doctrine. Essentially, it is an escalation to war against China. A key part of this war is what we call hybrid warfare, which is, as I mentioned before, it's economic warfare, trade warfare, tech warfare, cultural warfare, cyber warfare, legal warfare, of which the arbitral tribunal case is a key example. And of course, it is information warfare. The key point that I want to make is the US is already at war with China. It has officially declared China the official enemy. The term it uses is revisionist power, but it's already at war. And that war is currently in what we would call a pre-kinetic or a subkinetic phase. That is the warm-up or the preparation before the actual shooting war. But we're very, very close. And there are many, many signals that let us know that this is cresting very, very close into kinetic war. Okay. Now, it's worthwhile looking at how RAND has gained out war with China. And this is specifically war in the South China Sea. If there is war in the South China Sea, a shooting war, it would essentially shut down trade between China and the rest of the world. About 70 to 77% of China's oil passes through the South China Sea, and about $5.3 trillion worth of goods. And so the RAND has calculated that if there was a war, China's damage, the damage that China would receive simply from, the kind of damage in trade and economic damages would be about 20 to 35% reduction in China's GDP. And at the same time, this would impact US by 5 to 10%. So they're pointing out that China has a lot more to lose in the case of war. They also see that not only would it weaken China's economy, but it would embolden separatists. And that's another part of the hybrid warfare, is emboldening separatists in Xinjiang. This is why the US has removed ETIM from the terrorist list. And it would also undermine the legitimacy of the Chinese regime. And the current model is to split China, attack China, create internal dissolution, much as it did during the war with the Soviet Union. Okay, so once again, the key point here is the South China Sea. It's 70% of China's oil imports, and it functions like China's windpipe and carotid artery. Now, the Chinese response to prevent this encirclement and choking off at the South China Sea involves two things. One is to start to build out and militarize some of the islands to raise the cost of incursion for the United States and its allies. And of course, the other key response has been the Belt and Road. So just as during, the early Republican period when the communists were encircled, the Chinese engaged in the Long March, the long overland escape against the encirclement by the Kuomintang. This time, the other long march or the long escape is what we refer to as the Belt and Road. So the Belt and Road takes several overland routes through Xinjiang, which is why it's being weaponized, and also through Pakistan, and also through Myanmar, another reason why there's strife there, and then goes all the way across Eurasia through Iran, and then goes to Europe, goes to Africa, to the Horn of Africa, and creates this massive overland escape route against the bottleneck sea choke point of the South China Sea. Okay. Now, the Philippines is the most important player in this war game or in this gambit. It has 5 US bases, all very, very close to the key areas of the South China Sea. And of course, Subic Bay is back into play for the United States. Subic Bay, in case you don't know, is the largest naval base in the world. And it's actually larger than a few countries, including Singapore. So it's massive. So the level of power projection that is currently being prepared is unimaginable. Okay, so the specifics of the arbitral tribunal situation happened in 2012 when the Philippine armed naval vessels confronted arrested Chinese fishermen. The Chinese retaliated by preventing fishing by any parties. And then the Chinese and the Philippines became strained, and the Philippines, the Aquino III administration took the Chinese to arbitration. Now, the key thing to understand about this legal case or this arbitration, which forms the foundation for US belligerence and US claims against China, is that both parties are signatories to the UN CLOS. And Annex 7 is the clause that allows for arbitration between the two parties. Now, the Philippines takes China to court, to the arbitral tribunal, using the services of the white shoe US law firm Foley Hoag. Now, those of you who follow these things know that Foley Hoag is very, very closely tied in to the deep state. It's essentially an appendage of the US deep state when it wants to do lawfare. And it has very, very close ties to CSIS. CSIS is one of the key think tanks of the US Pacific pivot, and it's one of the key power brokers of US foreign policy. The other thing to understand is the Chinese don't want arbitration, and there is already an agreement process in place, which is the ASEAN-China Declaration for the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea. And also in 2006, they declared that they would not engage in the dispute settlement procedures. They would not do arbitration. And Article 298 says it gives every state that signs the UN clause the right to decline mandatory arbitration. And this is true for about 30 other countries. So no agreement for arbitration, then you cannot have an arbitration, because the arbitration only works if the parties agree to it. That doesn't matter for the Philippines and the US. Foley Hoag is, very expert at doing this kind of lawfare, and they argue that the fact that the Chinese have refused to arbitrate signals a dispute that has to be adjudicated by arbitration. And then once they start the court case, the arbitration, the Chinese, because they are not present, they cannot do a counterclaim. They cannot have a trial. And so what they do is Foley Hoag both argues the claims and then argues China's counterclaims in absentia. And they do this by drawing on sundry articles that they pick up through the media. And of course, this entire thing is put together by a far-right Japanese hawk, who is actually one of the key people who is working on gutting Japan's neutrality. So the entire thing is a paid arbitration. It's not an international court of law. It's a bought and paid for private arbitration, and it delivers the results that are expected of it. Essentially, they say that China has no claims to the South China Sea. Now, the key issue here is that the UN clause, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, cannot determine territorial sovereignty. That territorial sovereignty can only be determined by the ICJ or through bilateral negotiations and according to customary international law, not UN clause. UN clause is not yet considered part of customary international law. So the UN clause and the arbitral tribunal has no authority to make any judgment regarding this, because land sovereignty determines maritime rights and UN clause cannot determine land sovereignty. And the UN itself has disavowed the tribunal. So this is the core issue. Essentially, the US engineered a legal coup or a legal stunt to delegitimate China, and then essentially use that as a claim to back up Philippine claims, which it is then using as a potential casus belli or a potential trigger for war. Just to kind of go over the idea of the argument of the arbitral tribunal, it's a very interesting argument. Essentially, it's like if you were trying to determine the rights to a car, who owns a car or who owns a house. Essentially, what you would normally do is you would look up the title papers. But what the arbitral tribunal did instead was, instead of looking up the title papers, what it did was it started to look at the different components, that is, the different islands, the delimitations, etc. It's a little bit like if you were trying to determine who owns a car, you look at the tires, you see who owns the tires, you look at who owns the spark plugs, who owns, the oil, and you determine that each one of these things has been owned by different parties. The tires may have been recycled, the spark plugs may have been recycled, some of the components inside may have been recycled, etc. So essentially say there is no owner. And because there is no owner, it reverts to the UN clause foundations on EEZ. So it's a very, very clever little argument, but actually it has no legal validity. Okay. So essentially, once again, features, they were analyzing the features and what rights they generated, but features do not generate rights. States and state sovereignty generates rights. Okay. So anyway, essentially they said that the Chinese have no rights to the South China Sea. Big surprise. The issue here is that if we take this as a legitimate ruling, then the US air bases in the Pacific would also have no rights either. They would be downgraded to tide markers. And Japan would lose its EEZ around the key disputed islands. And actually, if we go all the way, the Netherlands would actually have to belong to Belgium, because it cannot exist without artificial features that prevent it from being submerged. So it's a very, very problematic ruling, but the US has made hay out of it, and it's made the claim that China has no right to the South China Sea. Therefore, it is acting in a belligerent and quote unquote imperial fashion with its neighbors. The Taiwanese also have a lot of problems with this, because they believe that their rights have also been abrogated. So essentially, we're looking at the key areas where war could break out: the East China Sea, in the South China Sea between the Philippines or Vietnam, North Korea, or a general incident at sea because of this massive overpopulation and belligerent showing of colors in the South China Sea. Again, Rand sends a message, or really a warning, to China that China has more to lose from a conflict. It does not have experience with the coordination necessary for high-speed, high-tech war, and that it would lose if it engaged in war. So all of this is posturing and signaling towards China. It says that the US should disabuse the Chinese of expecting victory at an acceptable cost. And it believes that the US should continue to make preparations to be able to wage a long and intense war with Korea. Steve Bannon also said that the US would go to war with China in the South China Sea within 5 to 10 years. So all the trend lines point in one direction. The key issue to emphasize is that the strategic interest is the capacity to choke China to death in the South China Sea. The Chinese have been building up islands, militarizing them, and making them somewhat defendable. The US objects to this. The US manufactured this escalation. The Chinese were never belligerent in this area, or even had excessive claims in this area until the US became involved. Until the early 2000s, all the parties were involved in negotiating and resolving these issues, as many countries all over the world are, related to the hundreds of conflicting claims around islands and sea territory. Just one example, China had a legitimate claim to the Gulf of Tonkin because Hainan Island abuts half of the Gulf of Tonkin, but it ceded the entire Gulf of Tonkin to Vietnam. This was, example of its good faith, good faith negotiation with its neighbors. Okay. So the other key issue, and this is, I think, important for us to understand in the global context, is the nature of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The UNCLOS establishes EEZs, and EEZs are a relatively new phenomenon. Those of you who are slightly older will remember that there was a time when the maritime seas only extended to about 5 to 12 miles out from the coastline. And the reason for that was that the territorial waters that you would claim were essentially the distance at which you could fire a cannon. If a ship came too close to your borders, you would fire a cannon and the ship would be warned off. And that was the traditional boundary at which maritime claims were made. Starting in 1945, the United States started to make excessive claims, and it claimed that it's essentially that the entire continental shelf belonged to itself. And a quick question for the audience. Does anybody know which country has the largest ocean territory? The answer is, right in the slides. The country with the largest ocean territory is France. The second largest country is the United States, and not by very much. Then you have Australia, Russia, United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand, etc. Essentially, what you have are the imperial countries who own a large part of the ocean. Why did this happen? As the world was decolonizing and the imperial center was losing its land colonies, it decided that it was going to maintain power by creating rights to ocean rights. So France is number one. You can see here the different contenders. Some of these countries have large ocean rights because they are archipelagic states, for example, Indonesia. But you can see that most of these countries that have large claims to the oceans are actually imperial countries. They're former colonizing Western European countries. So once again, these are the EEZs around the world. You can see that about 1/3 of the oceans are actually claimed by various countries. You can see that there's a difference between a territorial sea, an exclusive economic zone. And then beyond that, we have international waters. The exclusive jurisdiction beyond territorial seas was made by Truman in 1945, and then other countries started to follow. In 1960, the Second Conference on the Law of the Sea was held, and most of the developing nations did not have a say in this. It was largely the United States and the great powers that set up the initial structures for the UNCLOS. Okay, there are constant battles and disputes around the EEZs. France has the largest. France covers about 8% of the total ocean surface, although the actual land area of France Métropole is only about 0.45% of the earth. Ecuador has significant claims. Look at Greece. Greece is claiming a large chunk of the Adriatic. You can see that India has fairly large claims all around the Indian Ocean. Indonesia has large claims. You can see Japan has very, very large claims, very problematic claims, I would argue. Mexico has large EEZ claims. Norway has massive EEZ claims. Portugal has significant claims considering how small the country itself is. Spain, too. The UK has some of the largest claims, and you can see some of the large blotches below in the Indian Ocean are very, very strategic. These are some of the islands that the UK claims. It never returned these islands to the original owners. It still claims them. And therefore, this is one of the reasons why it has such extravagant maritime claims. Of course, the US has huge maritime claims all across the Pacific. And these are some of the other more granular claims mapped out. Now, the Philippines claims its EEZ, and it also, these claims overlap with China's claims. The key thing to understand is that as decolonization was creating loss of land, the European colonial states wanted to maintain control of huge ocean resources and passageways. U.S. had significant influence on the functioning or the forming of the UN clause. And then the key beneficiaries have been countries with large coastlines, archipelagic states, and the colonial and imperial powers. So, for example, New Zealand has a population of 5 million. China has a population about 1.3 billion. Their ocean claims are about the same. Also, Britain has about half a dozen islands, and the total population of these islands is about 200,000 people, about the same as Tempe, Arizona. The total land area is about the size of New York City. And these islands have the same accepted claims as China's current maritime claims. I'm giving you these facts because often there is a trope that says that China has exaggerated claims to maritime territory, especially in the South China Sea. But my argument is that actually that's not the case. The Chinese, with 1.3 billion, have about the same amount of claims as a few islands owned by the British. And of course, we can think that these maritime claims are a kind of colonization and enclosure of the global commons. So I think I'll stop this here. I think the key thing to remember is the US is escalating to war. It plans to go to war sooner rather than later. The war games show that the longer war is delayed, the more disadvantageous it is for the United States. And therefore, this is one of the key reasons for this escalation.
Thank you, KJ. Very informative presentation. What we're going to do now is take a short break to make a few announcements. And following the break, we will have our typical question and answer period where people are invited to raise their questions to the speaker or make a comment, limiting yourself to about 2 minutes. Mehmet, if you would do the timing on that, I'd appreciate it. You can, when we do that, you can signal your interest in raising a question by raising your hand either on the participant screen if you have access to it, or in the reactions button on the bottom of your Zoom window. Before we go to the Q&A, what I'd like to do is first ask Gene has a special announcement that he would like to make, and then talk a little bit about a couple of our upcoming programs. So Gene, if you would unmute yourself and make your announcements.
Okay, I'm unable to start my video, but that's not tragic. But let me clarify a few things. First,
Gene, would you please try again, please?
All right. Okay. No, let me make a little correction there. I had asked for 5 minutes to discuss the Veterans for Peace resolution on this matter. And so I would like to do that after, first of all, announcing future programs and the fund appeal by Richard. And then I would like to make that statement because it has a somewhat different approach than KJ has given us, which again is very informative, thought-provoking, and provocative. So with that, let me find, first of all—
Mehmet, if you would bring up the website to just show people the upcoming, that would be great, but go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I do have it here in the background, I believe. Yeah, I have it here. Okay, next week, July 25th, Grover Furr speaks on what is the crisis of Soviet history of the Stalin period and what should we do about it. So that will, as usual, be Grover's very provocative and informative discussion. Raj is going to introduce that. You can read the description here. I don't know if Raj wants to say more about it or not.
Yeah, well, just briefly that what Grover's research has shown is the history of Soviet Union in the period of Stalin, when he was the leader of the country and the party, has been smothered. That history has been smothered by lies from influential and dishonest sources. So that's his actually last decade's work, which he has spoken on specific topics. So he's going to say his talk is directed at what should we and must we do about it, the future of the world's working class, and fight for an egalitarian world of no rich, no poor. There's a book by Charles Andrews, as you know, with that title. And the world of no rich and no poor, Grover says, depends on what we do. So this is going to be a different kind of talk, and I think it'll be very interesting. And I hope everybody who's here comes back and more people joining. Thank you, Gene.
Okay, and then continuing, Sunday, August 1st is open. So if people have suggestions there, we have a number of possibilities we're discussing at this time. And then on August 8th, our comrade, Elazar Friedman, will discuss the imperative need to develop a Leninist united front to combat the menace of fascist and white supremacist attacks in today's U.S. And the moderator for that will be Mehmet. And I spoke to Elazar this morning, and Elazar asked me to make sure that he wants to talk to you, Mehmet, so he asked that you give him a call as soon as possible. And then after that, we have nothing else scheduled until November 7th. So that's our program. And does Richard want to say something about funding?
Yes, thank you, Gene. Yes, we continue to collect funds primarily for the Niebuhr Proctor Library, which is our physical home, and hopefully we'll be going back at some point to having our meetings there. I've posted on and we're collecting funds to a much more limited extent for our own logistical needs of ICSS. I posted on the chat the information to contribute. I urge people to, if they can, use PayPal, but we can also accept contributions by check, which you can do through your bill pay in your bank account. Most people have that. And you can, I think in many cases, you can do a recurring contribution. Even small contributions will be appreciated. Some people give $5, $10, $20 a month, and that's very helpful. And also Patreon, we can accept that. So thank you very much. Please continue to contribute, and don't forget to contribute. Thank you. Back to you, Gene.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you. And what I'd like to do now is read the statement of Veterans for Peace on this situation. And the title of it is U.S. Hands Off Taiwan and the South China Sea. Whereas Veterans for Peace, an educational and humanitarian organization dedicated to the abolishment of war, recently adopted Resolution 2020-02, Pivot to Peace with China and the World, which forms the basis for our work on US-China relations. And whereas one of the key areas where US policy is likely to lead to nuclear war, whether by design or mistake, is Taiwan and the South China Sea. And whereas the de facto government of Taiwan calls itself the Republic of China, but is not officially recognized by the United Nations, the United States, Canada, Australia, NATO, nor over 90% of UN members. It exists solely because of the early military support by the US before and after the 1949, culminating to the present in various forms. US arms sales to Taiwan in 2020 alone amounted to $5 billion. And whereas in 1972, President Nixon and Chairman Mao agreed that there is only one China and Taiwan is part of China, Beijing agreed to refrain from using force to reunite the island with the mainland if Washington would not have formal relations with Taipei or supply Taipei with significant military weapons. And whereas the time when the US Navy patrolled the Yangtze River is over, the Eurocentric idea that Asian countries require the United States to defend them from themselves has no place in the 21st century. And whereas the People's Republic of China does not now, nor has it ever, threaten the territorial security or people's well-being of the United States or any NATO country. And whereas the new Biden administration responded to the popular and congressional pressure and recognized that earlier US policies in Yemen have led to a humanitarian and strategic catastrophe. Accordingly, they announced a new policy of freezing US arms sales to Saudi Arabia and re-examining sales to the United Arab Emirates. President Biden put it quite simply: this war has to end. And much the same should be said for the Cold War on China. Therefore, be it resolved that Veterans for Peace urges the government of the United States to withdraw all military and naval forces from the Straits of Taiwan and the South China Sea. And be it further resolved that Veterans for Peace urges the government of the United States to re-examine arms sales to the Republic of China in Taiwan, and be it further resolved that Veterans for Peace urges its members and supporters to remember that the resolution of the status of Taiwan is the internal affair of the Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Straits, into which the United States has no right to intervene. And this was unanimously passed by various groups, various chapters, including the US, the Veterans for Peace China Working Group. And I just want to say a couple of things on that. First of all, the resolution itself in Veterans for Peace does not endorse any political party within the PRC or any internal policies of the PRC, nor does it favor China over any other Asian nation. Our resolution simply grows out of a central part of our mission, namely to restrain our government from intervening overtly or covertly in the internal affairs of other nations. So that's the statement from Veterans for Peace. And as a personal note, I'll just say that although Veterans for Peace does not endorse the current political system in China, not for me. As you know, I endorse the People's Republic of China and the control of same by the Communist Party of China. And if the United States starts a war there, it will lose. So I'll just stop there. Back to you, Alan.
Thank you, Gene. Okay, so what we're going to do now is open up the discussion for questions, comments, and answers from our speaker. And what we'd like you to do is to raise your hand. You can do that by raise your hand digitally. You can do that if you're on video using the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And we will try to take people basically in the order that they raise their hand, and we'll give precedence to people who have not spoken when it comes around to people who have raised their hand twice. So what I'd like to start with is Laura, if you would ask your question, and Mehmet, if you would take charge of the timing of questions, I appreciate it.
Yes,
Thank you,
I will
Laura.
be timing the questions and comments. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Laura.
Hey, the question that I have has to do with China's relationship to countries like Venezuela and other countries that are either sanctioned or having difficulty trading with other countries. And China has done a number of projects and contracts and trade with Venezuela and with the countries in Africa and all of that. And so my question has to do with how that figures into the scenario that we're facing. Thank you.
KJ, if you want to go ahead and respond. We generally take a question, have a response, just to make it a little more interactive. So KJ.
Thank you, Laura. That's a really important question. One of the key reasons the United States is currently sanctioning about 1/3 of the countries of the world. And one of the reasons why the United States is so adamantly opposed to China creating a new pole of development is because trade with China is allowing these sanctioned countries to escape US strangulation. So for example, in the case of Venezuela, or in the case of Iran, or in the case of many other countries, it's China which is throwing a lifeline and allowing these countries to function as sovereign states. Same thing with, for example, Cuba. And what the United States opposes is the fact that a key part of its hegemony is predicated on its ability to strangle and choke its enemies through trade sanctions. So that is a very, very important part of this. And of course, those of us who know the history know that China has had a long history of supporting non-aligned third world liberation movements. So all of this is part of a kind of historical it goes all the way back to the Cold War, and it has to do with the China bashing and the red baiting that goes back to the 1950s. But also it has to do with the very real fact that as China develops, it creates a different gravitational center whereby the United States can no longer have this full spectrum dominance over all of the world.
Okay, next up is Yusuf, followed by Richard Fallenbaum, and then Richard Wright, and then Mehmet. So Yusuf, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. This is actually a mainly technical question. Could you explain what 9- and 11- means, and maybe how it related to the Gulf of Tonkin? Okay.
That's also a very good question. initially, during the Republican period and when the Kuomintang, the Republic of China, the fascists were recognized by the United States, the Kuomintang claimed what they called an 11-dash line, which essentially claimed the South China Sea as their territorial waters. This is because they claim that, China has a long history of using these waters for itself, and that it also claims the majority of the islands inside it. This 11-dash line was widely accepted by the international community until the People's Republic of China took power. At that point, all of a sudden, it became a contentious issue. The 9-dash line is 2 dashes that go out into the Gulf of Tonkin, and the Chinese acceded the totality of the Gulf of Tonkin to the Vietnamese as part of their negotiation and rapprochement. It's essentially their good neighborliness towards Vietnam. And so the 11-dash line became the 9-dash line and no longer claimed the Gulf of Tonkin, which is now considered Vietnamese territorial water.
What's the dash line? I didn't understand that.
The dashes are simply the way that the lines are drawn. It's a series of 11 dashes or 9 dashes that delineate a rough outline of the claims to the South China Sea.
Thank you.
Okay, before we continue, I just want to encourage people to raise your hand and ask questions. This is an extremely important topic that has just been subject to the most one-sided and extreme propaganda in its appearance in the media here in the US. So I want to encourage everybody to please raise your questions, raise your hand, don't be shy. All questions are welcome. Next up is Richard Fallenbaum, followed by Richard Wright, followed by Mehmet.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Laura Wells's comment that this appears to be a war against the whole anti-imperialist bloc, not just China. And particularly, I want to draw attention and request a comment about the situation with Russia. Russia has stated that it would consider an attack, any attack that threatened its statehood and the statehood of its allies as a basis for a full-scale retaliation and using all of its weapons, so that the Russians, presumably, an attack on China could involve a Russian attack on Washington, D.C., or any other military bases, nuclear attack, which is not currently defendable. I wonder what you think, what your view on that, or how that, is that something that U.S. policymakers are taking into consideration in their plans for war, a kinetic war on China?
Again, another very, very important question. I would agree with you that this really is a war against US hegemony versus an anti-imperialist bloc. And the fact of this is that in 2017 and 2018, the United States came out with the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy. And in these two documents, it named what is now formulated as the 2+3. There are 2 revisionist powers, i.e. revisionist power is a fancy term for official enemy. The 2 revisionist powers were Russia and China. And the 3 are considered to be rogue states. That was North Korea, Iran, and non-state actors. These were the kind of minor enemies, and the great enemies were Russia and China. As a result, Russia and China, which have had a 20-year cooperation agreement, are moving towards tighter and tighter strategic cooperation, including military cooperation, including the sharing of military technology, of which Russia has probably the most advanced in the world at the current moment. What the US is trying to do at the current moment is it's trying to pull a reverse Kissinger. So having attacked Russia nonstop, incessantly for the last 4 years, at least, it is now, throwing out some inducements to Russia to see if it can split off this Russian-Chinese strategic cooperation, which is becoming incredibly tight and incredibly solid. But the ruling classes are divided in their strategies and their approaches. So it's not working as well as they hoped it would. But the fact is that this could go nuclear very, very rapidly. If you look at the documents that Rand put forth, they essentially have excluded the possibility of nuclear war. But in actual fact, this is very, very likely to go nuclear very, very rapidly for several reasons. The first is the US does not have what is called overmatch relative to China or to Russia in their territorial seas or near their borders. The US cannot prevail in a standard conventional war. And therefore, its strategy is multifold, but one of them is that it believes the US nuclear posture is that it will use nuclear weapons preemptively, aggressively against any major enemy if it believes that its strategic interests have been harmed or threatened. This goes back to the, if I'm not mistaken, the 2002 or the 2004 nuclear posture review. So the US will wage nuclear war in a non-nuclear situation. And the Chinese response, the Chinese do not have a first strike policy, but that could rapidly change, and it could put its missiles on hair trigger if it believes that the US will start off with nuclear warfare. This is especially the case because China actually has a very, very small nuclear arsenal. It's about 1/10 of what the US has. And therefore, unless it actually uses its nuclear arsenal rapidly, it will lose it very, very quickly. And so, ironically, the fact that China has a small nuclear arsenal makes a nuclear exchange more likely than less likely. I think the other key thing to understand is that the people who are driving this policy, this goes back to Wolfowitz and the Project for a New American Century, this war against China. You can trace it back to Wolfowitz. All of these people were mentored by a man that is sometimes referred to as Yoda. And Yoda was his name was this was the nickname for Andrew Marshall, and Andrew Marshall was the top advisor to 12 secretaries of defense. Those of you who know some of the history know that Andrew Marshall was one of the center of a key group of elite strategists, including Herman Strangelove Khan and James Lessinger, Daniel Ellsberg, and Wohlstetter. And their job was to plan for nuclear war and to war game out winning a nuclear war. So I think that the implicit possibility of this going nuclear is very, very real. And the fact that the RAND document, which is called War with China, is referred to as thinking through the unthinkable. That is a direct reference to the RAND document called Thinking About the Unthinkable, which was about how the US could win a nuclear war against the Soviet Union. This document was the basis for the movie that became Dr. Strangelove.
Okay, next is Richard W., followed by Mehmet, followed by Norma. And again, I'd like to encourage others to raise your hand and ask questions. Great opportunity.
First off, thank you, KJ, for such a really good presentation. I have a couple of comments, and then I have a couple of questions. One is I think that a lot of people look at it as a Russia-China axis versus the Western industrial axis. I think increasingly it's more the Russian-China-Iran axis, and we need to start looking at things in those terms. Secondly, I posted in a chat a reference to, it was interesting that Michael Clare came out with a strategic projection, I guess is a way to look at it. But basically from the US perspective and the implications of a war with China on the US population, things like conscription, things like the military costs and that kind of stuff. It came out just before, it came out like last week, and it's well worth the read. The questions I had is this. You didn't mention Taiwan at all, and increasingly the U.S. has been increasing its trade with Taiwan. I was wondering if you might be able to comment on that. Second question I had was increasingly there's a delinking of the U.S. The Western industrial financial institutions from China and Russia, and I was wondering if you could address that a little bit. And the third is while China's navy is not that big, I believe it will be buoyed by the Russian Navy, and they've been doing some maneuvering lately off of the Hawaiian Islands. I was wondering if maybe you could address that, and just to throw something else out there. Lately, there was a report of the Marines drilling with the Japanese in Japanese, which is dubious. Anyways. Thank you. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Those are all really, really good points. And just to reiterate what you said, I absolutely agree with you. It's not simply China and Russia. It's China, Russia, and Iran. The National Defense Strategy and the National Security Strategy explicitly names this. This is the 2+3 formulation. And we can see it largely as a challenge to Western imperialism. That is the key axis of which this challenge is shaping up. I think Michael Clare has been doing some good work, but I have some mixed thoughts about it. I appreciate the fact that he's coming out against war. I appreciate that he's showing the actual costs of war. My criticism of him is that he tends to recycle US propaganda. All the propaganda lies are just kind of packed in there. And then he backs down and says, but we don't want a war. And I feel that that is actually problematic because he delegitimates China even as he tries to argue against war, not understanding that this delegitimation is part of the war. It's a key part of the war. It's the subkinetic and prekinetic phase of the war, which is information warfare. So he's reinforcing the information warfare, even as he's arguing against war with China. Regarding Taiwan, I agree. I really did not cover that. Initially, when I was contacted, I was asked to cover Philippines. And because there's so much to cover, I didn't actually talk much about Taiwan. But it is very important. As I pointed out, they're the key issues. If you think of China as corresponding to the profile of a person's face, think about what the vulnerable points are on a face or the head. You can think that there is the nose, there is the chin, there is the jaw, there is the throat, there is the back of the head, where, or the occiput, where, where a rabbit blow is administered. The nose is Korea. Specifically, Korea serves as a bridgehead onto the Chinese continent. And this is why the Trump administration spoke about giving China a bloody nose attack by an attack on North Korea. The second really, really important vulnerability is the chin. The chin it hits directly to the medulla. It hits directly to China's core interest, which is Taiwan. So Taiwan serves as the vulnerability, is the chin of China. Of course, the jaw would be Hong Kong, and the throat, where China can be choked off, is the South China Sea. And then the back of the head, the occiput, is Xinjiang and its vulnerability to extremist separatism. But coming back to Taiwan, remember the Shanghai Declaration and the subsequent declarations were essentially the fact that the US would not interfere in Taiwan. It would not militarize Taiwan. It would not use Taiwan militarily, and it would not recognize Taiwan as a sovereign country. All of these claims, all of these agreements have been breached by this current administration, even more so than the Trump administration, which was flirting with it. The key thing to understand is that Taiwan, from a geostrategic viewpoint, is the dead center of the first island chain. It is, if you look at the encirclement of China, Taiwan is right at the center of that encirclement. And it is closer to Taiwan than any of the other island country or any of the other bases surrounding China. Specifically, Taiwan is about 90 miles away from the Chinese mainland. You can actually ride jet skis from China to Taiwan. It's that close. And not only Taiwan, but remember, Taiwan is an archipelagic state, and it has smaller islands that are even closer to China. The closest island to China is Jinmen Island, which belongs to Taiwan. And Jinmen Island, you can swim to it. I'm not a good swimmer, but I could swim from the Chinese mainland to Jinmen Island in about 90 minutes. Okay, it's that close. So if you want to think about, the geostrategic value of these islands as kind of unsinkable aircraft carriers, then you have to take into account the proximity of these islands to the Chinese mainland. The other point is that Taiwan controls what is called the Bashi Channel, which is a deep undersea channel leading out into blue waters. The Chinese continental shelf is very shallow. Chinese submarines inside that continental shelf are sitting ducks for US, to be picked off by US planes. if they can shift through the Bashi Channel, they're out in deep ocean, and they're essentially invisible. So Taiwan is kind of a gatekeeper to China's vulnerability for two reasons: because it controls the Bashi Channel, because of its position in the first island chain, and also because it is so close. And the simple fact is, not only is the US apparently seems to have been training Taiwanese troops. It has explicit plans for island warfare, and we can assume that this island warfare will involve Taiwan and Jinmen and the other archipelagic islands that belong to Taiwan. The US recently has allowed official meetings between Taiwanese and US diplomats and politicians, and it has been landing US military planes on Taiwan. I think just about a week ago, a US military transport plane landed on a Taiwanese airbase. So all of these are very, very ominous signs, and they point back to the fact that the US sees Taiwan as a key asset, and it is escalating very rapidly. The US model of warfare is based on what is called the third offset. The first offset was the offset with the Soviet Union. That is to say, the first offset is mass. Essentially, the United States was outmatched by the Soviet Union by conventional forces. So the US response was massive power, essentially nuclear weapons. That was how it believed it would defeat the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union responded with its own nuclear weapons. And so then the US started to look for the second offset. The second offset strategy was precision. The US believed that it could knock out all of Soviet conventional and nuclear forces using precision targeted guided missiles, essentially cruise missiles. So the second offset was about precision. China has matched the US in its precision and its guided missiles. So the US is currently working on what is called the third offset. The third offset is the offset against precision and mass, which is diffusion. So diffusion is essentially the idea that if the US goes to war against China, it will use subsurface warfare. It will use diffused warfare, swarming warfare, using all the islands in the South and East China Sea. And the Marines are specifically training for that. The Army, the US Army, is currently training for island warfare in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And of course, this diffusion also involves drones, automated warfare, as well as long-range standoff missiles that is outside of the Chinese periphery that are most likely nuclear, as well as automated warfare, that is AI-powered warfare. So these are very, very ominous developments. They're very, very far along, and all the momentum and the preparations signal that warfare is very, very likely. As regarding the decoupling of finances, one of the key elements of hybrid warfare, this pre-kinetic and subkinetic warfare, is economic warfare. And traditionally, the US has waged warfare against enemy countries by destroying their financial system, by sanctioning them, for example, as it does with Iran and Venezuela. And a Chinese response to this has been to create its own system is in the construction of its own financial and trade regulatory system, which tries to mitigate this. But yes, there is currently a lot of decoupling going on, and I think that it will accelerate even further even though the Chinese, because they are largely an industrial industry, and the US is a financial industry, financial capital, the US is still largely parasitic and dependent on China. But I expect these supply chains to decouple even further. And certainly in the domains of finance, there will be even more financial warfare and financial decoupling. And Richard said, haven't the Russians effectively countered swarm or diffusion weapons through improvements? Richard, perhaps you know better than I do, but it's a constantly evolving field. And so it's, it's action and counteraction. And I think that I wouldn't say that they've effectively countered swarming, because we haven't seen this, but in its full implementations, but in the small implementations that we've seen in smaller wars, swarming, especially the use of swarming drones, has shown a significant advantage.
Okay, Mehmet, you had your hand up. Did you want to ask a question, followed by Norma?
I think KJ has answered the question on whether United States will risk a nuclear war. So I think you have answered that. But tremendous presentation. Thank you.
Okay, Norma, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question. Then I have a couple of questions I wanted to ask KJ. Others, please raise your hand and ask questions. Norma?
Well, picking up on KJ's last point. Hi, KJ. The economic crushing of oppositional nations is also accompanied, it's not only done by the United States, but it's accompanied by local autocrats that want to try to maintain their control in the country, even Iran and every place. Jean, I wanted to thank you. I am thanking you for the presentation you gave. It's a very pleasant one about the veterans' position. I got interested in this because you're talking about, I see a lot of this war with China. Does anybody else have the reaction that it's war on China? Even though, of course, China would be compelled to oppose and retaliate any bombardments, although they've been bombarded already. So that's a question, is with the proper word to use there. Also, I'd like to remind everybody that one problem about Russia is that Putin regrets, and I've sent you this information published in the US press, that Putin regrets the loss of the Soviet structure of the USSR.
Okay, thank you, Norma. Those are all really, really good points, and I absolutely agree with you. When the United States wages sanctions on a country, a large part of that strategy is first, as Brzezinski said, to make them scream, but also to create a legitimation crisis for the country. If the country cannot feed its own people, if it cannot deliver as a government ordinarily should, then what you've done is you've set up the conditions for a color revolution or a similar tactic. And then often, there is a local autocrat or a US friendly puppet that is usually cultivated as a kind of an opposition. So,
which it's worth mentioning is not happening in Cuba.
It's
right?
it's not happening in Cuba, but for certainly in Venezuela, it was happening.
Yeah,
In Cuba,
right.
there is no meaningful opposition. It's a PR fabrication, what's going on right now. But certainly in Venezuela, we saw what happened with Guaido, you know, and et cetera, et cetera. We could, you know, we could go down the list. But I agree with you absolutely that this is not war with China, it's war on China.
Okay,
China does not pose a threat to the United States.
right.
China is not encircling the United States. China is not waging sanctions on the United States. China is not waging hybrid war on the United States. China is not persecuting American scientists in China. The US is persecuting Chinese scientists in the United States, etc. And the US is corralling the Quad, that's India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. It's corralling NATO. It's corralling the G7 to denounce and attack China. So it's not war with China so much as it is war on China. And the Chinese are, you know, responding with, you know, slow and calm measures, but they have been very, very measured in their response. So I absolutely agree with you.
I didn't emphasize strongly enough the fact that the Russians, having had their revolution, are also adherent as a national population, not just Putin, but the Russians themselves have been changed into a communist supporting population.
Yes, absolutely. And the other point that I will make there is that, you know, the Russians have seen what that counter-revolution did to them. They saw what it did to their sovereignty. They saw all the agreements that had been breached, and they saw, you know, the way that their country was picked apart and scavenged by the Western neoliberal powers. And so, you know, certainly they see their history in a different light. And this also ties into China, which, you know, in certain, I think, misinformed circles, people argue that, you know, well, you know, isn't China capitalist too? But the very simple fact is that simply the fact that you have markets in China does not make China a capitalist state any more than the fact that you have co-ops in the United States makes the US, you know, a socialist state any more than the fact that you have capitalists in China makes China capitalist. You know,
and they don't run the country. The
Exactly.
billionaires.
They don't run the country. In fact, China executes on average 1 or 2 billionaires every year. I mean, it's, you know, Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos would be, you know, dead, you know, several times over in China. But, you know, just to, you know, kind of, you know, put an end to this argument, China has long-term planned economic development for the common good, which no capitalist economies do. It's not a financialized rentier economy, which all capitalist economies trend towards.
Right.
There's public ownership of all land infrastructure and about 60% of the corporations, which no capitalist economy has. It has a near recession-free economic development. It doesn't have the economic cycles that capitalist economies have. And then it has they virtually eliminated poverty, hunger, and illiteracy, which no capitalist economy has ever achieved or even tried to attempt. There's a commitment to ecological and sustainable development, which is written directly into its constitution, which no capitalist economy will commit to.
Have they provided health care to everybody?
We have other questions I wanted to get people.
Have they provided health care
Norma,
to
I'd like to
everybody?
give other people
Almost everybody, yes. Thank you, Norma. Yes, almost everybody, yes. So, yes, please go ahead. I'm sorry, I got a little
No, that's okay.
distracted.
Next up is Trajan. Do you have a question? If you would unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, I have a question. Well, actually, it's a comment too. this pivot to China is so criminal because it's leading to a possible war, a nuclear war. And there's just so many problems going on in the world. I mean, the U.S. right now is being baked by climate change out west, and it's getting worse and worse. I mean, it's like almost 1/3 U.S. is baking in the sun. It's like turning into a desert. And the money they're spending on this, the war and nuclear war, could be going towards fixing the climate, trying to stop climate change, which, they really aren't doing much about it. But also, the American public is just disconnected. They don't even know what's going on. I mean, right now, also the peace movement. The peace movement is fractured. I don't see hardly any demonstrations. They should be demonstrating now to stop these possible nuclear wars. This pivot to China. When Obama proposed this, in the last years of his administration, that was criminal. I mean, why are you pivoting to China? You should be cooperating with all the problems around the world. And look at the results of the U.S. handling of COVID. And they're going to start a war with China. This is just absurd. That's my comment.
Okay. Thank you so much, Trajan. I agree with all of your points. I agree that it is criminal. I agree that it could go nuclear. And I agree that there are real and present threats that the US should be focusing and addressing directly. For example, climate change. And the US response currently is to ban Chinese polysilicon, which is essential for making solar panels. So they're essentially saying that, we're not interested in a sustainable development. We'd rather go to war with China. And, in my pessimistic moments, I say that the ruling elite would rather see an end to the world than to an end to their hegemony, which is why they're not concerned about climate change. And they're certainly not concerned about starting a nuclear war with China. But absolutely, I agree with you. We have so many other problems just on the simplest level, the US COVID response. Why is it that China had, 5,000 dead and the US has 600,000 plus dead and probably closer to 1 million if you do a correct analysis. We have, for example, 70 million people who do not have clean drinking water, and probably at least another 10 million people who have no access to any plumbing whatsoever. This is third world, failed state conditions. There's a lot of places where we could actually put our energy and our development, but instead we're escalating to war, and this escalation to war feeds the military-industrial complex. And so people are distracted, they're misguided, they want to blame US failures on COVID on China, which is why there's so much of this argument that somehow China is responsible for leaking COVID, a complete fabrication again. But the disconnection of the peace movement is so fundamental. And I'm especially disturbed by certain viewpoints on the left that try and frame, this war on China as a war with China, and that somehow it's some kind of inter-imperial rivalry. I mean, this is absurdity, because when I hear that, I hear, people, when people say Black Lives Matter, you hear the white supremacists saying all lives matter. This is a way of saying all imperialisms matter. That's kind of concocting, a kind of reverse imperialism, just as they talk about reverse racism. And again, in this group, we all know that, Lenin points out that inter-imperialist rivalry happens when a country becomes financialized, and that financial capital expands to exploit other countries. certainly not the case. Certainly not the case in Africa. And there are good studies by Johns Hopkins SAIS which show that China is actually doing essentially very, very critical work, and that there are no debt traps. Essentially, it's the deep state think tanks that are thoughtful. The thoughtful ones are actually refuting the claims that there's any kind of debt trap financing going on in Africa by China.
Okay, I have a question I'd like to ask then, followed by, Raj, did you have your hand up also?
Yes, I do.
Okay, followed by Jean and then Youssef. My question relates to some of the things you talked about in your presentation. There are some very real conflicts, confrontations, even in some cases, deadly confrontations between the different states that are involved with territorial resource rights, fishing rights in the South China Sea. Can you comment on what those are about, some of the conflicts with Vietnam? You've spoken about the Philippines, Indonesia. What do you think, how would you characterize those conflicts? And what do you think is the imperialist framing and a more internationalist framing for how we should view those conflicts and how they should be resolved?
Thank you, Alan. That's a really important point too. And the first point that I'll make is that there is a conflict resolution mechanism among the various countries, certainly in the South China Sea. And this is, through the brokerage of ASEAN. That said, occasionally these things do break out into skirmishes. For example, there was a battle at Johnson South Reef, if I'm not mistaken, between the Vietnamese. What happened in that situation was the Chinese were on Johnson South Reef carrying out a United Nations commissioned observation project. They were tasked to do this by the United Nations. The Vietnamese misinterpreted, they took this as some kind of territorial claim. And it's a bit like, they're a bit like easement claims. The idea is that if you allow somebody to put down stakes, then it's a problem. So you have to challenge them. So the Vietnamese went on and challenged them and harassed the Chinese scientific team. And this resulted in escalation, it resulted in bloodshed. Now, the framing often is that this was somehow about oil, but that's absurd. It's no more about oil than the Peterloo massacre was about oil. The fact is that the Johnson South Reef doesn't have any oil reserves. There are no proven or probable oil reserves, and there is the Reed Bank, but once again, the US is stoking. If you look at this conflict, you'll see that the US is behind all of these conflicts. The US came in with the US Geological Survey, which is odd because the US Geological Survey usually focuses on the US mainland itself and not on far distant oceans. But they claimed that the South China Sea, in particular, that the Reed Bank had oil reserves. Now, the fact is that the experts say that the Spratlys and that area do not have any proven or probable oil reserves. Okay. The fact is that there are potential oil reserves, but that doesn't mean that you can actually use them. It just means that they're theoretically, possibly, if cost were no issue and technology were no issue, then they could be, extracted in some fashion. But the simple fact is that these issues are largely geostrategic, and the US is stoking these geostrategic conflicts, for example, between India and China, between India, Pakistan. All of these things have to do with geostrategic issues. Economic issues are secondary, and the Chinese have a mechanism. In fact, all of the ASEAN countries have a mechanism that they're currently working out these territorial conflicts with each other. China is the country which has the largest land borders of any country on the planet. It has 14 land borders, and it has worked out almost all of its territorial conflicts with them in an amicable way, except with a few exceptions. So I think that if the US were not putting pressure and not stoking sides and not stoking extremism and maximal claims, I think these issues would eventually resolve themselves.
Yeah, I would add to that. I did some reading in preparation for today's session that, for example, the conflicting claims over the Spratlys, even if China withdrew, there are still plenty of conflicting claims between Vietnam and the Philippines. It's not just a question of China versus everybody else. The Spratlys and the Scarborough Shoal play a very important role in countering the possibility of a very real submarine attack against the mainland of China, that without those defenses being placed in some of these island areas that the Chinese are developing, and with access to the Scarborough Shoals, the Chinese would be very vulnerable to nuclear submarine attack on their mainland. And as you pointed out, they have a much smaller response nuclear force. This is much like in Russia and the Crimea. This is their land base. You cannot remove the presence, the aims, and the actions of the United States and the Quad from your consideration of this question. If you do, you're just blowing smoke in the eyes of the people of the world as far as what's going on there. And these things are just never brought out. It's all framed in a very pro-US imperial way. Next up is Raj, followed by Jean, and then we'll probably get close to wrapping up. We have Yusuf also, but we're getting close to the end. Raj?
Yeah, KJ, thanks for your presentation. Very detailed one, and you made a tremendous defense of China. But I don't think things are so one-sided. China is a capitalist economy. It is not a socialist economy. The 60% that you say is government-owned, they are actually not government-owned. They may have somebody sitting on the board, but they have at most 25%. Today in China, 25% government shares, and it's all run on the basis of profit and loss, okay? They're exploited and exploiters. You mentioned the oppressed billionaires in China. That is really reversal, putting Marxism, Leninism on its head. If it was so dangerous to be a billionaire, why be a billionaire? Just be a worker. No, China is a capitalist economy. There cannot be any defense of China as a socialist country. So that's number one. Number two is Chinese economy has grown, okay, due to capitalism, okay, it has grown. That is success, and they should be given credit for that. It's a very large economy, second only to the United States. And as such, United States does not want a competitor, okay? And then on the other hand, China needs to export its goods and its capital. It's the second largest exporter of capital, okay, China today. That is a emergence of an imperialist aspect of Chinese capitalism. It cannot be otherwise. Okay, so this interpretation that you can have capitalism in a country, but the country remains socialist, is actually untenable under Marxism-Leninism. It's another theory that you must be using, because under Marxism-Leninism, it is inconsistent. So either you reject Marxism-Leninism and say, well, there's an oppressed country, China, and Xi Jinping's speech was nothing but nationalism, Chinese nationalism. I read it carefully. There's hardly anything, there was no question of class struggle or anything like that, no question of workers' power. Just declare themselves as a worker state, but there is the capitalist and workers. How do you defend all this?
Thank you, Raj. Those are really important points. And, I'm not going to be able to engage fully with that. I think that merits its own session at the NPML. But I'll say a few things. First, there is the Trotskyist line, and we've had it for a long time, that China is a deformed worker state. So I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of that argument. As you know, there are varying sides align up with that. But as I said, I agree with you. China is not socialist. What it is a proto-socialist state. And the Chinese have explicitly said this. They said we are aspiring to socialism, and we hope to have that in a few decades, in about 3 decades. But at the current moment, what they're trying to do is they are trying to create a moderately prosperous society that creates the productive forces so that they can move towards socialism. And I think it was Marx himself, I think volume 3, who talked about the need to develop the productive forces in order to build socialism. You do not get socialism simply by jumping from colonialized feudalism into some kind of idealized socialism. If you have any thoughts about that, I invite people to watch a movie called The Wandering Earth. It's really a metaphor about China. Essentially, the earth is falling into the sun. It's going to die. And what the world decides to do collectively, not individually, but collectively, is they decide that they can use the gravitational force of another planet to pull them out of this declining orbit and far away into another universe where they can actually have, a decent existence. As they do this, this starts to fail, and this, the Earth starts to be pulled into the orbit of, I think it's Jupiter, but they're being pulled into the orbit of Jupiter, and they're starting to crash and burn. And so then they work collectively to, resist this, and then launch themselves far out into the future. This is a metaphor. You do not get, Raj, you do not go from feudalism straight into socialism. There is a process. There is a process of developing the productive forces. And as I said, yes, China is not socialist yet. But at the same time, we have to be very careful in the West about critiquing any of the existing practices and existing experiments that are striving towards socialism in favor of some kind of idealized model that we in the wealthy West have kind of concocted for ourselves. You can't expand a bike co-op to a country of 1.3 billion. It's not that simple. But once again, I will ask you these questions. Is there any capitalist society which has consistent
You mentioned all these things already.
No, Raj, let me finish, and the moderator can have your response. My questions to you is there a capitalist economy, a purely capitalist economy, which does long-term consistent economic development? Is there a capitalist economy? Is China a financialized rentier economy? Is it or is it not? Does it or does it not have public ownership of all land and infrastructure? Does it or does it not have, has it or has it not avoided capitalist economic cycles? Is there any capitalist economy that has had the virtual elimination of poverty, hunger, and illiteracy? And I'm assuming, Raj, that you're from India. You should know what the costs of that hunger and illiteracy and poverty are. We cannot dismiss that. And also, is there any capitalist economy which has grown without primitive, is there a capitalist economy that has grown up without primitive accumulation, that is slavery, colonization, appropriation, exploitative war. That is the foundational basis of capitalism. And is there any capitalist economy that has a scientific approach to development, such as trial spots, that China has? I think you need to think about those questions, and we can have this discussion at a later point.
I'd like to just quickly remind people, we have just another minute. I'd like to actually move ahead. We should do a session on this. Definitely a good question. I'd like to actually give Gene a chance, who hasn't asked a question yet, to basically ask the last question, because we're at 12:30 now. So then we'll open up to more open discussion. Gene, if you would ask your question.
Okay, well, KJ, thank you so much for this. It was really, I always enjoy listening to you, even when I have some doubts about some of the things. And the thing I just wanted to raise is I'm concerned that you rely too heavily on basically the RAND report and similar things. And as we used to say, military intelligence isn't. And that's very true in this case. And just think about what the United States has done since, recently. It waged war on China from 1945 to 1949 until it was beaten and driven out. It waged war on Korea and lost that. It waged war on Vietnam and lost that. It's waging war in the Middle East. So it's consistently losing these wars. And I think one has to bear this in mind, that it's a case of overreach on the part of US imperialism. And as a Marxist-Leninist, I side with my communist comrades in Beijing that understand Marxism-Leninism far better than many people who call themselves Marxist-Leninists here in the United States. So but thank you very much, and I look forward to further discussions.
Okay, what I'd like to do is now just give KJ, if he wants, just a couple of minutes to wrap up any final thoughts about this, and then we'll shift over to more open discussion. So KJ, if you have any final comments, please go ahead and make them.
Yes, no, I agree with what Gene said, and perhaps it looks like I've been relying too heavily on government documents, but the fact is that sometimes it's useful to see what they're saying. Sometimes it's actually useful to take them at their word. If they say they're doing something, sometimes it's worthwhile to believe that, or at least to understand it as signaling, that they're specifically signaling certain kinds of intent for very specific purposes. And I think there's a large body of work, not simply in US documents, but other analyses that show that the US is clearly escalating to war. Now, the other question which you asked, Gene, is equally important, is can the US win a war with China? And, if the war doesn't go nuclear and stays conventional, it remains whether it could win. We know that the US waged war against China during the Korean War. This was when China was incredibly impoverished. It had one of the most, it was, poorer than Haiti at the time. It didn't even have soldiers. They didn't even have a rank system in their military. And, they showed up with mismatched rifles and mismatched sneakers. And yet they were able to fight the US to a complete standstill in South Korea. So much so that General MacArthur said that anybody, any country that wants to have a land war in Asia has to have their head examined. So we know that the US waged war against China and essentially lost during the Korean War, when China was practically at its weakest. A few decades later, when the US started war against Vietnam, the Chinese explicitly warned the Americans, if you invade North Vietnam, we will engage directly with you. And as a result, the US never took the war to North Vietnam. They bombed the hell out of it, including Laos and Cambodia, but they never actually engaged in direct set piece battles against inside or against North Vietnam. So they know that history. But what I'm afraid of is this current generation of warmongers. Some of them are millenarian Christians that believe that the end of the world is nigh, and anything that hastens it will actually be a good thing. They're waiting for the rapture. And you have another group that are much younger that have not learned the lessons of previous wars. And despite losing, despite turning tail and running away from that global power known as the Taliban, they believe that they can engage in war with China and prevail. I suggest that people go to CNAS, the Center for New American Security, and look at some of the documents that they are generating and how they're explicitly strategizing for war and how they believe that war can happen and that the US can prevail. So I think that the risk of war is real despite the overreach. And I think that it's incumbent on everybody in the imperial core to fight against this, to prevent this war from happening. There are no good outcomes, regardless of your political viewpoint, regardless of whether you are a trot or a neo-trot or anarchist or whatever you subscribe to. There are no good outcomes that are possible. We have to struggle. We have to fight against this. And capitulation, despair, and certainly support directly or indirectly by using this rhetoric of quote unquote inter-imperialist rivalry, that is anathema, and that will lead us all to complete catastrophe.
Agree with you on that.
Okay, I just
so I'm
want to
going to
wrap up,
stop.
Raj, I just want to wrap up now.
Okay, I just want to
We
stop the
we can have an
recording.
open discussion. I wanted to thank KJ for his incredibly informative and valuable presentation. Especially, we contacted him very late in the cycle of invitations because of the developments that were taking place this week in the South China Sea. And I very much want to thank him for stepping up and really putting in the work and doing a very, very informative presentation. I also want to thank the participants who raised excellent questions during the discussion. I want to urge everybody to go to the ICSSmarks.org website and sign up for to receive notifications of our presentations. We have a few very good ones coming up and more after that. And again, I want to thank KJ for your generous time and effort in this very valuable presentation. So.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml@marxistlibr.org. And the website is Marxist